Buenas tardes a todos. Soy Bárbara Barrios de la Dirección de Relaciones Internacionales y Convenios. Bienvenidos a este webinar sobre derechos políticos y participación ciudadana que ha sido organizado por las Facultades de Derecho y Ciencias Políticas, de Negocios, Logística y Ciencias Marítimas y esta dirección, en conjunto con Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs de Syracuse University. Nos acompañan en esta tarde la decana de la Facultad de Derecho y Ciencias Políticas, profesora Ana Matilde Gómez, el decano de la Facultad de Negocios, Logística y Ciencias Marítimas, capitán Orlando Alard, la directora de la Escuela de Derecho, profesora Magali Castillo, la directora asistente de programas ejecutivos de la Escuela Maxwell, Margaret Lane, y la interpretación de inglés a español la estará realizando el estudiante graduando de Banca y de Derecho, José Abel Almengor. En caso de que tengan alguna pregunta sobre la exposición de nuestro panelista, les agradecemos que las escriban en la sección de preguntas y respuestas, Q&A, para que nuestro moderador, que es el capitán Alard, pueda hacerlas al final de la disertación. De igual forma, les vamos a pedir que respondan la encuesta de satisfacción sobre este webinar que van a colocar en el chat al final del evento. Para los que van a necesitar escuchar la interpretación a español con la que nos va a apoyar el estudiante José Almengor, en la parte inferior de su pantalla hay un icono que se llama Interpretation en forma de un círculo. Cuando le dan clic, seleccionen la opción en español. Sin más, le paso la palabra al decano, capitán Orlando Alard, quien nos hará la presentación de nuestro invitado y quien será el moderador durante esta tarde.
Muy buenas tardes, saludos a todos, especialmente al doctor Reeher. Muchísimas gracias por tener esta excelente oportunidad para todos nosotros, ¿no? De escuchar a una persona con una trayectoria impresionante en estos temas, ¿no? El doctor Grant Reeher es director del Instituto de Asuntos Públicos de Maxwell School of Citizenship y Asuntos Públicos, la Universidad de Syracuse. Las investigaciones y los estudios del doctor Reeher se enfocan principalmente en la política americana de los Estados Unidos de América y teoría política, con un énfasis, por supuesto, que en política legislativa, representación democrática y ciudadanía activa. Una gran trayectoria en todos estos temas y es una de las razones principalmente por la cual quisimos invitarlo a este webinar. Ha escrito numerosos libros, entre ellos, por supuesto, First Person Political, es un libro sobre la vida legislativa y el significado de servicio público. Otro libro también es Narrativas de Justicia, y es las creencias legislativas sobre distribución y sobre la distribución. Es coautor de Click on Democracy, el poder del Internet para cambiar la apatía política y convertirla en acción cívica. Y puedo seguir enumerando los otros libros que el doctor Reeher ha escrito, pero todos definitivamente que enfocados en estos temas de tanto interés para nosotros como es la ciudadanía, como es la democracia. Algo muy importante también que al menos a mí me llama mucho la atención, que el doctor Reeher es creador, productor de un programa de radio en Public Media, WRVO Public Media, que se llama The Campbell Conversations. Muy interesante este programa, es a nivel semanal y a través del National Public Radio. Y es un programa pues que hace entrevistas profundas inclusive ha presentado a candidatos políticos en este programa, ¿no? Y es muy conocido por este programa que ha recibido muchos premios también. Yo podría seguir toda la tarde hablando acerca del doctor Reeher porque tiene, como dije anteriormente, una trayectoria impresionante en estos temas que nos competen siempre y especialmente en el día de hoy, ¿no? Así que con esto me gustaría presentarles al doctor Reeher, quien nos enorgullece realmente con su presencia y su participación en el día de hoy. Doctor Reeher, por favor.
Well, thank you, Dean Allard, for that introduction. And I want to thank Dean Gomez and Director Barrios for all three of you for providing me the opportunity to speak to you here today. It's a great honor for me, so thank you. I was thinking a few days ago about this talk and remembering that my very first roommate at college, university, was from Panama. And we sort of lost touch with each other after college, but I decided to look him up on the internet because I was thinking about speaking to a group of folks in Panama. It turns out he's a very, very big investor. He has become a huge financial person in Panama. So I don't know if the name is famous, but his name is Roberto St. Malo, and he was even he figured in the Paradise Papers, not the Panama Papers, but the Paradise Papers. So maybe I should try to get back in touch with him. But I want to thank you for this opportunity. What I am going to speak about are two of the topics that were suggested to me. One of them was the Republic, the US Republic, the American Republic. And I want to apologize in advance. I will at times use the word America to refer to the United States. I recognize that the United States is not all of America, but that is the way that people in the United States often talk about the country, and actually there's a point to be made about that perhaps later. But one of the topics was the Republic and the consolidation process as a democracy.
Y el proceso de consolidación como una democracia.
Okay, and the other was political rights and citizenship engagement and citizen participation. And so in the United States, those two things kind of overlap, and I wanted to speak about both of them. Now, that's a very, very complicated topic to try to cover in a short amount of time. And so I will just tell you at the beginning, I'm going to engage in a lot of simplification, and I hope that it is simplification that will clarify rather than simplification that obscures. But you'll be the judge on that. But even though I'm going to speak on this topic, I want to just emphasize that you can ask me questions about anything related to US politics, past or present. I'm happy to engage a question on any topic. So please don't let what I'm about to say limit what it is that you want to ask about. You can ask about anything. But I did want to talk about these two topics. I think they're important for understanding the United States and also for understanding some pretty big issues about rights and about citizenship. So let me start, because I think we need to do this. We need to start at the beginning of the American Republic and the beginning of the United States of America, and look back to that time and understand a couple of important things about the thinking that those who founded the country and constructed the governing system that we have had at the front of their minds and were the most concerned about. And the first of those things is that American thinkers and the designers of the political system had a very heavily individualistic emphasis in their thinking. They started with individuals. That was the building block from which everything else comes out of. And there are a lot of reasons for this in their thinking. Some of them having to do with the material conditions that they were living in at the time in the colonies. And I can come back to that. But there were other reasons as well. And we don't have time to get into all of those. If you want to explore those, we can do that. But let me just say, for the purposes of our discussion here, that they begin with this very individualistic emphasis, as opposed to an emphasis on society, or as opposed to an emphasis on a nation. They start with individuals. And they think about the problem of, or the issue of creating a governmental structure from the standpoint of individual rights. And these rights are asserted to exist. And again, we can talk about whether the argument that they put forward as to how they know that these rights exist is a persuasive one or not. But they start with the assertion of these individual rights, and they are thought of then as rights that we as individuals carry around with us anywhere that we go. And then they are therefore thought of as limits on what government can do. That government is therefore necessarily very limited and needs to be limited in order not to have enough power to encroach and to violate those individual rights. And a lot of those rights pertain to what I can do with my activities and what I can do economically, particularly property, rights related to property. So you have the famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the way that they understood the pursuit of happiness was largely in terms of the pursuit of property and what we do with our property. So this is the beginning, this is the fundamental building block for the founders. Now, they also had a strong suspicion coming out of this emphasis on individual rights on strong forms of democracy, which they thought of as being too direct and too subject to the whims of group think and changing views that groups might have about what is the best path to follow. That they had a suspicion of direct and strong democracy, and they had a suspicion of more communitarian and societally based ways of constructing political institutions. And also a suspicion and a reluctance, and this is going to be very important in understanding how this plays out later, a suspicion and a reluctance to think about politics in terms of economic class terms. So they had a suspicion of strong direct democracy and class politics. And so they wanted to create a government that was limited and one that started with the notion of an individual rather than a group or society and worked its way around that concept. One of the ways to illustrate this is one of the events when the United States, before the United States became the United States of America, but after it achieved its independence from Britain, it lived for a brief period of time under this set of governing rules called the Articles of Confederation. And this allowed quite a bit of authority for the individual states that were in the Confederated States. The 13 original colonies now become new states under the Articles of Confederation. One of the events that took place at that time, which shook the founders up and made them think that they needed to create a stronger national form of government that would become the United States of America, was something called Shea's Rebellion. And that was a rebellion of debtors. It was a class-oriented action. It was a group of folks who were in debt, rebelling against the money lenders and the banks. And this was something that scared the founders and made them think, if we don't have a system of government to deal with this kind of group activity, this class activity, the republic is going to be under threat. And so this is the original mindset of the founders and their construction of things. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that one of the reasons why there was this individualistic emphasis was because of some of the material conditions at the time of the founding. Let me just say a word about that, because I think this is also important to understand the beginnings of the story. And here I've got to be very careful with my language. So I'm going to speak very slowly here to make sure the interpretation comes through, the translation comes through. But among the group of people living in the early colonies in the early United States, among the group who were considered to be citizens, and this is a subset of all of the residents. So I'm taking large groups of people out of the equation here. But of the group that were considered citizens at that time, and what we are talking about here are white males who had some kind of property of some kind or another. So I've eliminated slaves, I've eliminated women, I've eliminated other people of color for the most part, and I've eliminated people who are completely destitute, okay? So among that group, though, of white men with some kind of means, there was, in the early period of this country, a fairly high degree of equality. Most of these folks were small farmers or merchants. You did have some very, very wealthy people. You did have some very, very poor people, but you did have among these white males a fairly strong degree of equality. And most of them, as I said before, owned small farms. The reason why this is important is it helps to explain why, when the founders were looking at the context in which they were living, when they were looking out at their world, they did not see a need for government to be changing society in some important way. What they saw was a concern for creating a government that would be powerful enough to disrupt this relative equality and relative success that they were already experiencing. So they already enjoyed quite a bit of liberty and freedom. They already enjoyed a wide expanse of relatively unrestricted activity when it came to their ability to actualize themselves in their world, to pursue their happiness, to enjoy their life and their liberty. And so they wanted to protect that rather than to create through government an agent of social change. And so that is why, in part, in their mind, they're able to focus on individuals because individuals already, in their mind, white males who were the individual citizens, already enjoyed quite a healthy degree of equality and liberty. So you can understand then that might lead you to be more conservative. And I don't mean that in the current sense of Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, but in a more philosophical sense, a more conservative approach toward what it is that you're going to build in order to govern that society, okay? So there was an assertion then at that time of a certain kind of equality, but it's a political equality rather than an economic equality. And indeed, both the early thinkers and Americans generally, and this is why I'm talking about this, because this continues throughout American history, there is at the same time that there is this strong assertion of a political equality, a very high tolerance for economic inequality. And again, some of the early reasoning behind that is that that was not seen as a problem. So if we were to imagine a case where the founders today might be putting together a governmental system, they might see this world differently because the United States is far more unequal today than it was among the group at that time that thought of themselves as citizens, as active full citizens, okay? So this is all preamble to then understanding the construction of the political system in terms of rights and in terms of citizenship, okay? So let me get into that a little bit here. And I'm mindful of talking too long. I just want to throw some things out and then we can see what we want to discuss from here. So that leads then to the construction of a national governing structure in the United States that is going to be designed to limit government and to limit government's ability to do things in profound ways. The founders deliberately constructed a political system that made it easier to say no to something rather than to say yes to something, okay? And the reason, again, is because they were more worried about government doing things than they were worried about government not being able to do things. And therefore, the architecture of the system that you have is one that builds into it and that does this through a number of different mechanisms. One of them is the fragmentation of the governmental system. Our political system in the United States is extraordinarily fragmented. It's both fragmented horizontally and vertically in different ways. But the reason for that fragmentation philosophically is to set up points in the governing process where things can be stopped by minorities against the will of the majority. The majority acting, one of the things that the founders worried about was a strong government that would act on behalf of a majority acting through the mechanisms of government, using the leverage of government mechanisms in order to threaten minorities of different kinds. And again, in particular, they were thinking about minorities who had property when they were thinking about this. And so there are a lot of points of veto set up in the political system. One of the ways that you do this is you have the ability of a president to veto legislation that the national legislature passes. You break your national legislature up into two equal branches so that either one of them can veto what the other one is wanting to do. And in order for them to put something to the president's desk for signature into law, they both have to agree to it in exactly the same form, down to the last comma and the last period. You have a court system, which is very, very powerful. And the fact that we have a powerful court system reflects the emphasis on individual rights, because the way that you bring something to a court is an individual has to say, I have been wronged, and I am bringing a case to protect myself against this wrong. Okay, so you empower a court system then that asserts its power to declare actions of the president and laws to be unconstitutional and therefore void and not applicable. And then you divide government up into different levels, from the national to the state to the local, and you give those state and local governments real power and real authority. That's another way in which you can weaken national government. And so the founders constructed this very complicated, messy, ugly system for the very purpose of keeping things difficult and making it hard for there to be simple majority rule. And they were extremely successful in this. And so what we have in the United States is not a system of majority rule. What we have is a system of supermajority rule. And what I mean by that is there are moments and there are issues on which there is a great amount of support. And when you have those moments, then you can get over all of these obstacles that the founders created in order for government to do anything. Okay. And so that's the system that's constructed in the abstract. Again, I won't go into too many of the details here. Okay. So the bottom line is it starts with individuals. It asserts individual rights. It creates a system to protect those rights by making it difficult for government to do things. It thinks of those rights as rights that we hold against the government if we need to assert them against the government. And the main reason that government is there is in order to enhance and protect and advance those individual rights. It's not there to push one group over another, and it's not there to try to make society different than it was at the founding, all right? That was not the mission that the founders put forward for the government, okay? So how does this all fit with democracy and equality? Well, the answer is it fits very awkwardly in many instances. And there's a tension here in the United States between those things, and there always has been. And so the founders, if you'd had asked them, did you create a democracy? They would have said, no, we created a republic. And there was a very clear sense in their mind that they were creating something that was, although representative of the people, still at a level of distance from the people, and also one that was constructed in a way that was difficult for government to do things in many instances. Okay, so what are some of the early developments in the American Republic toward more democracy that also help to reinforce the sense of individualism? The most important one, arguably, and this is where the United States differs from other democracies in the Western world and their development and the story of their histories and their development, is that in the United States, very early on, there was an expansion of the right to vote among white males. In other countries like Britain, for example, which we broke from, that expansion takes place over the course of 100 years. In the United States, it happens in about 10 or 15. And very soon after the establishment of the United States of America, you have the situation where the right to vote is basically held among all white males. This does something very powerful in terms of thinking about politics in class terms. What it does is, and I don't know of anyone who's been able to tell me this, whether this was done in a deliberate way or whether it just kind of evolved this way because of the general level of equality among white males. But what it does is it takes away one of the main ways in which class-based political movements are able to gain traction in other countries. They're able to gain traction in other countries because they advocate for the right to vote for members of their lower economic groups. In the United States, there's no reason to do that because that right to vote, again, only among white males, but that right to vote was made almost universal so soon in our history. There was no need for a Labor Party to be founded on the idea of winning the right to vote for people without property or people without income because the white males already had it. And so this in turn reinforces this sense of individualism in the United States and makes it even tougher for more class-oriented politics to develop. So again, another way in which rights are understood in very individualistic terms, okay? So now this sense of rights can cut both ways when it comes to democracy, all right? On the one hand, you can think about individual rights as rights against the government, rights against the government acting even on behalf of majorities. And so we can think about minority rights and the assertions of minority rights as something that could stand in the way of more democracy. And it has done that in the United States. And it also has stood in the way of policies that reflect the needs of society and also the desire of majorities. You can see that right now in the conversations that we're having in the United States about what to do to fight COVID and whether or not people should be required to get vaccines. The idea that we would require people to get vaccines in this country, which if we're going to look at this from the standpoint of health and public health and societal health, we ought to have, runs against the American grain of thinking because it runs into my sense of my individual rights and my sense of freedom. You can't tell me to get a vaccine. That's considered to be un-American. That's actually a phrase in the United States. Something's un-American, right? So an idea or a policy is un-American, right? So you can see how it might get in the way of things. But it also is a vehicle for the development of democracy if we think about individuals having rights to participate in their government. And that is another way in which individual rights then, as the United States progresses, begins to be seen. It's a different kind of right. Instead of being a negative right, a right against government intrusion, it becomes a positive right, a right to be able to participate, a right to be able to do something. And this gets most famously turned into law, into the Constitution, in some of the amendments that get made to the Constitution during and after the Civil War in the United States, that basically say you cannot discriminate, you cannot limit the right to vote for, again, at that time, it was males. You cannot discriminate the right to vote for males on the basis of race or et cetera. But over time, those categories widen, and there are more groups that are put into that individual right to participate. Women, and then in the 60s and the 70s, people under the age of 21, but older than 18. There is, and so this individual notion of rights can be a mechanism for pushing democracy forward. If we think about gay rights and the protections for people with different gender identities, if we think about all sorts of different kinds of ethnic groups and their right to participate in the governmental system, in the American way of thinking, these all have their bases in individual assertions of rights, rather than as rights because I am a member of a group. It's because I am an individual. It's because I'm a human being. It's because I am an American citizen. Okay, and so again, though, as I said before, it can cut both ways. Now, if we think about what does the United States, if we think about the United States as an exporter of political things, as an exporter of political goods, all right, one of the ways in which the United States has been a chief exporter around the world has been this notion of individual rights. It is something that other countries, particularly the countries in Europe, have picked up on in the latter half of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, and are emphasizing more and more. I mean, think about, again, I keep using the case of Britain because Britain is the country outside the United States that I know the best, but this kind of language and thinking was foreign in Britain up until like the 1970s, 1980s. And now you have an actual independent Supreme Court in Britain that you didn't have 25 years ago. And you have this notion of a set of individual rights that British citizens have. Now, they don't have them to the same extent that citizens in the United States have them. Parliament is still supreme there, but you have them much more than you had in Britain 40, 50 years ago. This is and so what goes along, what institutionally goes along with that way of thinking is a stronger role for an independent judiciary and a stronger role for the courts. And this is the other piece of what the United States has exported to other countries around the world. When other countries around the world look to the United States and say, maybe there is something there that is worth copying, usually the thing that gets copied is the independent court system and trying to figure out political reforms which strengthen the role of the judiciary. And that's not unrelated then to the notion of a set of individual rights that are pushed forward. Again, all of this is different from thinking about politics in terms of class, economic class, and the clash of different classes, and thinking about government as the way in which classes are going to push their interests and to get things that they want at the expense of the other class. That is not the way that the United States, people in the United States tend to think about their political system, even though we have those clashes, okay? Make no mistake that we have those clashes. And there is tension politically between those with means and those without means. And that tension can be seen in differences in voting patterns. But that is not to say that that is the way that we think about our political structure and the way that we think about the very nature of politics in the same way that, say, a European or someone, perhaps in your country, I don't know that, you know, your country has a very complicated political history of its own, but certainly to think of perhaps maybe the way that politics would be thought of in Brazil or Venezuela or Mexico for that matter, okay? There's less of a class emphasis in the United States than there would be in those countries, all right? And so that's the way in which I think in the United States, the development of democracy and this notion of rights of citizenship have proceeded, that it's all taken, I think it's for the most part taken place against this background context of individualism individual rights that can be traced back to this defining sort of birth moment for the country. And one of the paradoxes or the ironies of the political history in the United States is that our mindset and our thinking is in some important respects has not changed in 240 years, even though our country and our nation has changed dramatically. And even though the problems that we have faced over the course of our country's history have been the kinds of problems that have been faced by governments all across the West. How do you create a governmental structure that can resist the concentrated power of wealth through corporations and through wealthy individuals? That needs a counterbalancing power. We have struggled with that question in the United States because we are so individualistic in our thinking. And so that has created our own unique set of problems and challenges that we deal with here in the US. Let me just do this last thing and I'll stop. I want to talk just 2 or 3 minutes on because I've talked for longer than I intended to, and I apologize for that. But let me just talk for a minute about institutions, democratic political culture, and the success of democracies, because there are lots of observers of the American political system that think our democratic process is in existential threat right now because of the president that we just had, and because of the political conflict that his presidency both reflects and helped deepen. The debate here is, what is it that ultimately grounds a democracy? Is it the institutions that govern it, or is it the culture of the people who live in it? And I think the answer here is it's a symbiotic relationship between both of them. And what I mean by that is, if you do not have a sufficiently democratic political culture, the institutions will not guarantee that you will have a democracy. And if you do not have the right institutions, but you have the culture, that also will not guarantee that you will have a democracy. You've got to have some elements of both, and they serve in the good times to mutually reinforce each other, so that you have a populace that understands that democracy is important, that it puts certain responsibilities on people, that it means that government is limited in certain things that it can do, and you have institutions that reinforce that. And that's what you have in the good times. But in the bad times, what you need is either the institutions or the culture to come in and help when one becomes weak. My own view of the last 4 years of American democracy is that it's a story of the strength of institutions. Not all of my colleagues see it this way, but I see the Trump presidency as a story of the strength of political institutions, because you had a president that I think is pretty clear to say did not really have a strong democratic culture in himself. He did not have a terribly great respect or concern for democracy. But the institutions limited him in some very profound ways. And the institutions survived. You had a president that said the election was stolen, the election was rigged, that I actually won in a landslide. Completely preposterous. The institutions were able to withstand that. And so I think that in the United States, we do have institutional resiliency. And I think we are in a moment right now where our institutions are helping our culture, I hope. And I hope that at least in my lifetime, I will be able to see a situation where the culture reasserts itself in a democratic way, because I can remember when it was earlier, and will help the institution when the institution becomes weak. So I'll leave it there. That was a lot. I apologize, but I'm trying to sort of simplify and put some big picture around all this. So please, though, ask any question that you would like about anything. You can ask me about Joe Biden, Donald Trump, whatever, or Thomas Jefferson, or James Madison. We'll go anywhere the conversation wants to take us. And I don't know what mechanism, Barbara, you had for taking questions, but however you want to do it.
Well, we have a chat. The chat is one option.
Okay.
And the other one is just asking the question.
Sure.
I have to say that I have enjoyed this tremendously.
Oh, good.
I've been a buff of American history for many years. Of course, not even close to you, but
wow.
It's been very enlightening. And the question throughout in my head was, but before the question, I think we have many similarities at the beginning of our country. I mean, for many reasons. One, because we became independent,
right,
with the help of the United States and many things. I think we managed to learn lessons from you and all that. So we began pretty much with the same, with similarities. And my question from then on was, where did we go wrong? What happened? And one thing that stands out that you said is independent court system. And Decana Ana Matilde Gomez, of course, she is an expert on this issue, but I mean, I think that was a very important turning point, and the importance of an independent court system. And in my mind, listening to you, I mean, I think that was a turning point. At one point, I don't know exactly when, but that's just a comment that I wanted to make. And I think there is one question.
Somebody has a question about Black Lives Matter, but I don't know what the question is, so it'll have to be translated for me.
How has politics changed since the Black Lives Matter movement?
Okay, well, that's a very good and complicated question. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has given, ironically, I think it has given strength and advantage to both of the political parties in this country. And there are things that both of them have drawn on from that movement in order to push and to strengthen their messages. Clearly, for the Democratic Party, African Americans are overwhelmingly loyal to the Democratic Party. And so any movement that pushes out on the rights of African Americans, and in particular, here is a right against the police, all right? It is a right that's being asserted on behalf of a group of people against a government entity, in this instance, the police, is something that has helped the Democratic Party in a way, because the African American community and those that are sympathetic with the concerns about how the police have been treating African Americans are going to be more naturally in the Democratic Party. So anything that activates and engages and increases the energy level around that group and those sets of issues is going to help energize the Democratic Party. On the other hand, it also has helped to advance some of the Republican Party messages, and not just in a simple kind of racist way. That is, we're going to try to sow fear among white people that they're somehow in danger from this Black Lives Matter movement. That's the simple way to think about it. But there's a deeper, more philosophical way in which it helps the Republican Party message, in the sense that it's a group-oriented push, and there's another kind of reaction to say, is this the way that we want to be thinking about our political life? Is this the way that we want to be constructing our political dialogue? Is it really, do we want to pit one group against another group? Well, that taps back into and resonates with the individualistic way that Americans tend to think about politics. The problem isn't that a group is being treated in a certain way. The problem is this person got treated this way by this individual policeman. And so that is where we need to, that is the intervention that we need. Not a group-wide intervention, not a police-wide intervention, but we need to go after that bad police officer. And so it gives both sides sort of some material to work with. I do think, though, that the idea of questioning the police in a pretty deep way is now in a different place than it was prior to that movement. So I think that movement has had a big effect. But it's important to remember, though, that it doesn't come out of just nowhere. And it goes back, you know, you can track this back to lynchings, if we want to go back to the early part of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century. And we can think fast forward, we can think about the civil rights movement and the way that civil rights activists were being treated by police in the South in the 1950s and the 1960s. And then we can think about Rodney King and the beating that Rodney King took in Los Angeles in the early 1980s. These are all moments in that progression. And so I think the Black Lives Matter movement is when I say simply, I don't mean only, but is the most recent kind of inflection point in a number of inflection points historically in the United States. One way to think about American political history, to go back to what I said earlier, is to say that the fundamental sort of way of thinking about rights is set in place in 1787. And then the story of America after that is going to be just how fully and extensively realized is that way of thinking about rights. Who gets to be included? Who's going to be excluded? And the story of America is one of additional incorporations of people into that group, whether we're talking about women, whether we're talking about people who are, transgendered, whether we're talking about, whatever it is that we're talking about, it's who's included in that group. And so that's one way of thinking about it. But again, that is consistent with and able to be fit under this sort of more individualistic way of thinking about rights. But it's a big question.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Barbara, I know we have just a few minutes left. I don't know if anybody else has any other question, any other comments? Grant, I'm sorry to pose this question because it's rather unfair because
it's okay.
It's going to take a long time to answer, but we don't have that much time. But
okay,
you at the end, towards the end, you mentioned this dichotomy between culture and system.
Yes.
And of course, this is un-American, is a phrase that I think we all know. Do you think immigration will have an impact on that? On this culture, on this ingrained culture of the American people?
That's a great question. And I'm going to give you a very simple answer. And and now I want to just say, you are getting one person's opinion.
Okay.
I do not think it will fundamentally change the mindset that I am talking about in the next 100 years. Maybe beyond that, it might, but I don't think so. And the reason why I say that is because I am looking back at American history from here, and the fact that I think that mindset is just as strong today as it was 200 years ago. And if the last 200 years didn't change it, it's hard for me to imagine the next 100 will. The groups are, the groups that are immigrating are coming from different places now than they did before. The political conversation is changing, but I still think that there is, look, the notion of, this is another thing that's kind of strange about, I mean, the American political psyche is what's the word I'm looking for? There's a lot of mental instability in the American political psyche. There is a lot of a lack of mental health, and one of the ways that you see this is the very way, I don't know, maybe this is a good thing, not a bad thing, but the notion of what it means to be an American is what's in your head. It's what's in your head. And there is, and now we're getting into a whole another topic, but it's no accident that there is a association between that orientation and Christian thinking, in that if you want to become a Christian, all you have to do is believe, right? That's all you have to do. And then you can become, what's the idea of being born again? You can be a born again Christian in an instant. You just have to have the moment. It's a similar thing with the idea of what does it mean to be an American? It means to believe these things. And so I think as long as that is the understanding, then I think you've got a system where different kinds of immigration and conversations about immigration aren't going to affect that in a fundamental way. It certainly will affect the question of inclusion and incorporation and those kinds of things. But I don't think it necessarily affects the fundamental thinking in that regard. So I think the short answer to your question is no, I don't think so. Not in the next 100 years. And it may be that that's the defining feature of the United States. And when that no longer is the case, then the United States will cease to be, what we would normally recognize it as. Let me just say one other thing, if I could, really quick here. It goes back to something I was saying earlier, but this is just a little historical artifact, which I find fascinating and which I think illustrates where the founders' mindset was. 4 of the major founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams, they all thought in their lifetime that the American political system had changed in a way that made it that it was going to fail. They became very pessimistic in their lives during their own. But now Hamilton was killed early in a duel with Aaron Burr. He didn't live as long as the other 3, but all 4 of them died thinking that the American political system, the experiment, was not going to last much longer than they were going to be alive for. And they each had different reasons for being pessimistic. But the reason that what they all saw was this special thing, this special kind of government that was created that had gotten off on the wrong path somehow. And I find that very, very interesting. The only one of the founders who was really optimistic about the future was James Madison, and he was the architect of the institutions, not the culture. And so the institutionalists thought, oh, well, we're okay, we're going to be okay. But Washington thought we had become too politically polarized, if you can believe that, back in back at the end of the 1700s. Jefferson thought we had created a national system of government that was way too powerful and was going to obliterate the very thing that made America, America. Hamilton thought that we had made the other mistake and that the national government wasn't strong enough and it was going to collapse out of weakness. And Adams thought that we had lost our participatory civic culture and that we were no longer, participating in the political system in the way that was healthy enough to keep the thing going. So they all thought that, well, after I'm dead, the thing's going to collapse. I thought that was fascinating. And I wonder what all four of them would think if we could go to 2021 and see that, we're still here.
Barbara, back to you.
Le damos las gracias a nuestro expositor por la disertación tan interesante en la que nos habló sobre cómo funciona el sistema en Estados Unidos para que nosotros podamos sacar nuestras propias conclusiones. Para dar las gracias por habernos acompañado en este evento, le cedo la palabra a la decana de la Facultad de Derecho y Ciencias Políticas, la profesora Ana Matilde Gómez. Nuevamente, gracias.
Well, it was a real pleasure to us to have such a distinguished member from the Academy this afternoon. Allow me to speak in Spanish, please.
Sure.
En nombre mío propio y el de la universidad, profesor Grant, muchísimas gracias por este recorrido histórico que nos ha permitido de alguna manera comprender el razonamiento lógico a través del cual los americanos, como usted se disculpó para llamarse, los americanos entienden y explican su democracia y la democracia que exportan al mundo. La dialéctica, la forma dialéctica en que usted ha contrapuesto argumentos a favor y en contra de esa visión individualista que da origen a los derechos fundamentales y a las garantías individuales ha sido extraordinaria desde el punto de vista docente. Me ha encantado escuchar la forma histórica en que usted habla desde los padres fundadores para explicarnos la lógica de la arquitectura de poder que existe en los Estados Unidos y cómo lo que para la exportación y para los medios puede ser un debate entre las personas y su cultura democrática y las instituciones, para ustedes es el fortalecimiento, por lo menos digo que para usted, y yo comparto su punto de vista. Personas como el presidente Donald Trump, y nosotros tuvimos nuestro propio modelo de Donald Trump y lo padecimos también. Son personas que ponen a prueba los sistemas y ustedes se fortalecieron. Como usted bien dijo, la presidencia de Donald Trump logró probar la fortaleza de las instituciones. Gracias por esta explicación de la evolución de la relación entre gobernantes y gobernados. Y el mensaje final que me puedo llevar es que los ciudadanos debemos primero creernos ciudadanos para luego exigir los derechos. Nosotros mismos somos quienes podemos reforzar esas instituciones que son la democracia. Y pues como bien mencionó el decano Alar, esa dicotomía entre personas e instituciones la estamos viviendo en América Latina. Usted sabe que hay un resurgimiento incluso de los pensamientos que pueden llamarse las ideologías de las izquierdas, y no es porque se esté yendo a la izquierda, es porque las derechas no han satisfecho las necesidades más básicas. Así que la desigualdad sigue siendo el gran problema. Y nuevamente, profesor Grant, muchísimas gracias por esta ilustración de esta tarde. Gracias por compartir con nosotros y este auditorio tan selecto. porque a pesar de la hora y de tantos inconvenientes, pues hemos sacado el tiempo y yo me privilegio de haber estado aquí. A la orden siempre, y esta es su casa, la Universidad Católica Santa María la Antigua, en nombre de nuestro señor rector magnífico, el profesor Francisco Blanco, de todo el equipo de vicerrectores, los decanos, y a la profesora Bárbara, a la doctora Bárbara, nuestra directora de organismos internacionales o relaciones internacionales y convenios. Muchas gracias por abrirnos esta oportunidad. Decano Alar, fue un placer compartir con usted también. Y a nuestro estudiante de ambas facultades, el estudiante Almengor, muchas gracias por el esfuerzo que ha hecho esta tarde y el despliegue de ese talento del dominio de otra lengua, que no es lo mismo hablarla que traducir. Así que un aplauso para usted también y buenas tardes a todos.
Muchas gracias for the opportunity, and I so much appreciate being able to speak to you. So thank you very much. It was my pleasure. I hope it was useful.
Oh, yes, it was.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Hasta pronto. Hasta pronto.
Hasta luego. Gracias por todo.
Gracias, José Abel. Excelente trabajo. Gracias.
Sí, excelente.
Bye-bye. Adiós.
Bye bye.